In a little over a week, Christopher Nolan's film adaptation of the Odyssey will be released in theaters. I plan on seeing the movie because anytime there is a movie that takes place in the ancient world or has anything to do with ancient history or archaeology, I am always 100% down to see it. Now, Nolan's adaptation of the Odyssey has come under fire, rightfully so, for numerous inaccuracies with respect to Mycenaean, Dark Age, and archaic Greece. For one, look at how Nolan depicts Mycenaean armor and helmets. Then there's also the armor that is shown on the theatrical release poster, and all I can say is, good God, what the fuck is that? I think everyone who knows the slightest bit about the Mycenaeans agrees that this is a glaring inaccuracy. Nolan chose to portray Odysseus and his crew wearing some cliche, dark-colored, Hollywood sword and sandal armor, when in reality, Mycenaean armor was much different, as shown in the photo on screen. It also looks like in the movie, the armor is made of iron, even though the Odyssey is supposed to take place during the late Bronze Age, when iron was not used. Even the helmets are incorrect. Whoever was in charge of the costume design decided to go with a stereotypical Hollywood Greek helmet with a crest. If Nolan wanted to be historically and archaeologically accurate, he should have included the boar's tusk helmet. Most of the other costume choices irk me as well from a historical accuracy perspective, and I wonder what the costume designers were thinking and if they even cared about historical accuracy. Better yet, do they even know anything about ancient Greece? Or did they think to consult experts on Mycenaean archaeology? Anyway, many of the characters that appear in the trailer are shown wearing trousers, long-sleeve tunics, and fantasy-style vests, making these characters look like they are straight out of either the Middle Ages or a medieval fantasy movie. The Mycenaeans in real life would have worn short tunics and clothing more suited for a hot Mediterranean climate, as shown on screen. Oh, and don't get me started on the ships that oddly look like Viking ships. Also, to anyone who says, "Who cares about historical accuracy? The Iliad and the Odyssey are myths." First off, the culture that produced it, ancient Greece, was very much a real historical civilization, and these two epic poems are reflections of mostly Dark Age and Archaic era Greece, with some kernels that reflect Mycenaean Greece, also a real-life civilization. With an epic poem that is clearly a reflection of the culture of ancient Greece, I would want the director and everyone in charge of various aspects of the movie, from set design to costume design, to not only be faithful to the poem, but also to accurately recreate the ancient culture itself. Second, there is archaeological and primary source evidence that demonstrates that the Trojan War was a real historical event. Troy was a real city, called Wilusa by the Hittites, which was discovered in the late 19th century by Heinrich Schliemann. Subsequent archaeological excavations have found several destruction layers, including one that dates to around the 12th century BCE, the time of the Trojan War described in the Iliad. The Hittite tablets describe characters from the Iliad as historical individuals, most notably Alexandru, aka Paris. They also talk about conflicts with the Ahiawa, or the Mycenaean Greeks. Even if the vast majority of the Iliad and Odyssey are legendary, there are still glimmers of historical memories from the late Bronze Age. Now, let's focus on perhaps the biggest historical inaccuracy that many, especially the Greeks themselves, are rightfully pissed off about. This is the big elephant in the room when it comes to how inaccurate much of the casting was from both a historical and archaeogenetics lens. The casting of Lupitanyongo as Helen of Troy. Now, anyone who knows even the slightest bit about ancient Greece would know how absurd this casting choice is. Ancient Greeks, including the Mycenaeans, were a Mediterranean population whose ancestry was a mix of Western Anatolian farmer, Caucasus hunter-gatherer, and Yamnaya steppe-like ancestry. Lupita Nyong'o, on the other hand, is a sub-Saharan Black African, making her the exact opposite of an ancient Greek. Several scientific papers have been written about the many ancient Mycenaean genomes that have been sequenced, including 2 papers that were published within the last few years, specifically in 2022 and 2023. The DNA evidence that these 2 papers describe is quite clear. The ancestry of the Mycenaeans is a mix of early European farmer, very similar to the Minoans, along with Caucasus hunter-gatherer and West Eurasian steppe, or Yamnaya-like ancestry. The 2022 paper included a sample of a Mycenaean individual from Crete, dated from 1370 to 1340 BCE, who had around 24% Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry, which was one of the components of the Yamnaya-like ancestry. The 2023 study estimates the average West Eurasian steppe ancestry in mainland Mycenaean Greeks is 22.3%, with potential source populations coming from Bronze Age Serbia, Croatia, Italy, German corded ware, or late Neolithic to early Bronze Age steppe peoples. I think the 2022 paper by Lazaridis et al. Provides the simplest and most succinct, yet most likely, explanation of the Mycenaean genetic makeup. They were an outcome of northern Yamnaya-like steppe migrants mixing with a Mediterranean farming population that was very similar to the Minoans. Out of all the modern populations, modern Greeks and southern Italians are genetically the closest to the Bronze Age Mycenaean Greeks. So, if Christopher Nolan cared about what the genetic data says about who the Mycenaeans were and what they looked like, he would have cast Greek and Southern Italian actors. I couldn't help but notice that none of the main cast is Greek or Italian. All of this is to say, if there was a historical Helen of Troy, she would have looked like a Mediterranean, perhaps fair-complexioned woman, very similar to light-complexioned Greeks and Italians of the present day. Now that we have looked at the hard scientific evidence for what the late Bronze Age Mycenaeans looked like and where their ancestry comes from, let's take a look at what the primary written sources say about Helen of Troy's physical appearance. Now, granted, even though Homer, or the multiple poets known collectively as Homer, composed the Iliad and Odyssey several centuries after the Trojan War took place, these are still our earliest written sources. And yes, I know the Iliad and Odyssey started off as oral traditions, but a few centuries later they were written down, so you know what I mean. Anyway, when we look at how Homer describes Helen of Troy, he doesn't say much about her physical appearance, but there is one line that is relevant, as it tells us about her complexion. In the Iliad Book 3, line 121, Helen is described as being white-armed, which basically means she has pale skin. So once again, this is literally the opposite of lupitanyongo. The rebuttal from those who argue we don't know what Helen would have looked like or that the skin color of the actress playing her doesn't matter is that white-armed is a euphemism for upper-class, aristocratic women who stay inside all day. My response to these people is, what do you think the etymology of leukolanoi, or white-armed, is? Why did the Greeks refer to aristocratic, elite women as being white-armed? Could it possibly be that aristocratic Mycenaean and classical Greek women had the luxury of staying inside all day, making their complexion pale? This is precisely why this argument for the race-blind casting of Helen falls flat on its face. Homer would have pictured Helen as a light-complexioned Greek woman with Mediterranean facial features based on the description he gave and the fact that these poems were composed in Greece. Helen of Troy's physical appearance is also described in two other primary sources, from the poet Sappho and the playwright Euripides, both of whom describe Helen as having light-colored hair. Sappho in one of her poems describes Helen's hair as xanthos, as does Euripides in his play Helen, specifically line 1224. Classical scholars agree that xanthos can be used to describe blonde, golden, light brown, or reddish hair. Light-colored hair can be found among Southern Europeans, so it is not surprising that Helen would have this hair color. I have provided several primary sources that prove Helen of Troy was thought of by ancient Greek poets and playwrights as being a pale Greek woman with light-colored hair, yet those who defend Lupita Nyong'o being cast as Helen of Troy have not provided any evidence to support their position. If they wanted to demonstrate that it is historically accurate or even plausible to cast a black African woman as Helen of Troy, they would need to provide primary source evidence that describes her as being an Ethiopian, which is the Greek term for black Africans. Yet there is zero primary source evidence, zero ancient Greek poets, historians, playwrights, or tragedians that use the term Ethiopian to describe Helen of Troy. In answering the question of what Helen of Troy looked like, we can also look at ancient Greek and Roman art. Whether it is Greek amphorae or frescoes and paintings from Pompeii, Helen is universally depicted as having pale skin with light-colored hair. This indicates that ancient Greek and Roman artists, and by extension Greek and Roman society, saw Helen of Troy as a pale-skinned, light-haired woman. We can look at the Minoan frescoes to see how women were depicted in the Bronze Age Aegean, obviously relevant to the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Minoan frescoes all show women as pale-skinned, most likely because in Minoan and broader Bronze Age Mediterranean society, Women stayed indoors carrying out domestic duties. All the evidence, whether written or visual, points in the direction of Helen being fair-skinned. The other arguments that I hear in defense of casting Lupita as Helen of Troy is, Helen of Troy is a mythical figure who did not exist. She was literally born from a swan egg after Zeus, in the form of a swan, had sex with her mother Leda. She is literally a demigod. Historical accuracy does not matter. Along with, the Iliad and Odyssey are myths filled with made-up characters and gods. Who cares what race the actors and actresses are? Firstly, Helen having a miraculous birth story does not refute my argument that the ancient Greeks, whether poets, playwrights, or ordinary Greeks, saw Helen as being light-complexioned. So if Nolan wants to be faithful to the culture that produced these epic poems, maybe he should consider what the ancient Greeks thought. Second, these are the same people that were super triggered by Northern European actors playing Jesus, who has his own miraculous birth story in the Gospel of Matthew. As for the "these are myths" argument, firstly, as I explained earlier in this video, there is solid evidence that shows there was a historical Trojan War, meaning there is a kernel of historical truth in the Iliad and Odyssey. Second, I guarantee these people do not actually consistently hold this position when it comes to casting, because the public, especially wokes, was super outraged over white actors being cast as the main characters in Exodus, Gods and Kings, and Gods of Egypt. Yet these movies are based on myths, and Gods of Egypt literally has the Egyptian gods in them, but played by white actors. It looks like the people making this argument have selective outrage. It's not just leftist film critics or random people on Twitter defending Lupita being cast as Helen of Troy. There are even some scholars who are engaging in mental gymnastics in order to justify this casting. Take Flint Dibble, for example. First, let me say that I sometimes watch Flint's channel, and he has some good videos and streams, and I thought he did well in his debate against Graham Hancock. Now, having said that, this Twitter argument he has here is just a stunning display of fallacious argumentation and cognitive dissonance. In his first tweet, he calls the people criticizing the blackwashing of Helen of Troy racist ghouls, then made an overly simplistic statement about Bronze Age civilization spanning 3 continents. Newsflash, Flint. There is a difference between North Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans. Ancient Egyptians were a West Eurasian population, as you probably know since you made a video on the Old Kingdom individual whose genome was sequenced. Predictably, a bunch of people started dragging him in the replies, including one person who calls him out for being dishonest. This person, named Keith Woods, attaches a genetic heat distance map showing modern Southern Italians and Greeks as being the closest to the Mycenaeans, along with a graphic explaining how the Ethiopians or Black Africans were viewed as foreign or alien to the ancient Greeks, not as neighbors. Flint responds with a bunch of insults and postures as an expert who knows more than this Keith guy, rather than addressing the evidence that was presented. Flint Dibble continued to be evasive, not answering the questions, then makes a vague, half-false claim that DNA studies of the ancient world show greater mobility and intermingling between people of Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is quite clear what Dibble is doing here. He is conflating and equivocating Iron Age Berbers, Sicilians, Greeks, and Phoenicians with the broader categories of quote-unquote people of Africa, Asia, and Europe. So he can sneak Black Africans into this claim of Africans having mobility and intermingling with Europeans in the ancient world. I talked about one of these DNA studies he is likely referring to, the 2025 study on the Carthaginians, and the results do not show what he claims they show. They show the Carthaginians were mostly of Greek and Sicilian descent, with a minority North African component. Flint then makes the bizarre claim that he would not be surprised at all if someone with a dark skin tone was in an Aegean noble house. You just got caught. What do you mean by darker skin tone, Flint? He is purposely being vague to give himself plausible deniability, because dark skin could refer to anything from an olive-skinned Mediterranean, a Pakistani or Indian, or a Black African. I then decided to respond, saying, quote, "What's with the Mott and Bailey? Darker skin tones? How about answering his question? Based on the DNA evidence we have from Mycenaean Greeks, do you think there were Sub-Saharan Africans or Bantus among Mycenaean nobility?" Flint still did not answer my question or any of Keith's follow-up questions. The reason why I brought this up is to show the amount of cognitive dissonance and dishonest argumentation about a notable amount of Black Africans living in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Despite being an archaeologist who supposedly values scientific evidence, data, and facts, Flint Dibble ignored the evidence presented to him and resorted to being a leftist tribalist. He is merely using his credentials and expertise as an archaeologist to run defense for the brain-dead arguments being made by his tribe with respect to the current discourse on Helen of Troy. At the end of the day, it is blatantly obvious to anyone with a functioning brain that Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is filled with glaring inaccuracies, including race-swapping Helen of Troy, but also casting other races, including Indian and East Asian actors. I mean, having Indian and East Asians portray Bronze Age Mediterranean characters, do I need to explain how this is blatantly historically inaccurate? Also, why the fuck is Travis Scott in this movie? But I digress. It is safe to say I will not be able to maintain any suspension of disbelief whatsoever for this film, but I am still going to go watch it in theaters when it comes out next week, both because I am always interested in seeing movies that take place in the ancient world, and I am also curious to see if this movie will be a train wreck as many people are predicting. Let me know in the comments if you guys plan on seeing The Odyssey in theaters.